Hi, I'm Wendy, and I'm here with New Deal Creative Arts Stories at 7. We are reading The Secret Garden, and today we are reading chapter 23 called Magic. Dr. Craven had been waiting some time at the house when they returned to it. He had indeed begun to wonder if it might not be wise to send someone out to explore the garden paths. When Colin was brought back to his room, the poor man looked him over seriously. "You should not have stayed so long," he said. "You must not overexert yourself." "I am not tired at all," said Colin. "It has made me well. Tomorrow I am going out in the morning as well as in the afternoon." "I am not sure that I can allow it," answered Dr. Craven. "I am afraid it would not be wise." "It would not be wise to try to stop me," said Colin quite seriously. "I am going." Even Mary had found out that one of Colin's chief peculiarities was that he did not know in the least what a rude little brute he was with his way of ordering people about. He had lived on a sort of desert island all his life, and as he had been the king of it, he had made his own manners and had had no one to compare himself with. Mary had indeed been rather like him, and since she had been at Misselthwaite had gradually discovered that her own manners had not been of the kind which is usual or popular. Having made this discovery, she naturally thought of it of enough interest to communicate to Colin. So she sat and looked at him curiously for a few minutes after Dr. Craven had gone. She wanted to make her ask why she was doing it, and of course she did. "What are you looking at me for?" he said. "I'm thinking that I'm rather sorry for Dr. Craven," she said. "So am I," said Colin calmly, but not without an air of some satisfaction. "He won't get Misselthwaite at all now that I'm not going to die." "I'm very sorry for him because of that, of course," said Mary, "but I was thinking just then that it must have been very horrid to have been polite for 10 years to a boy who was always rude. I would never have done it." "Am I rude?" inquired Colin. "If you had been his own boy and he had been a slapping sort of man," said Mary, "he would have slapped you." "But he daren't," said Colin. "No, he daren't," answered Mistress Mary, thinking the thing out quite without prejudice. "Nobody ever dared to do anything you didn't like because you were going to die and things like that. You were such a poor thing." "But," announced Colin stubbornly, "I am not going to be a poor thing. I won't let people think that I am one. I stood on my feet this afternoon." "It is always having your own way that has made you so unusual," said Mary. Colin turned his head. "Am I queer? Am I unusual?" he demanded. "Yes," said Mary, "very. But you needn't be cross," she added impartially, "because I'm unusual too, and so is Ben Weatherstaff. But I am not as unusual as I was before I began to like people and before I found the garden." "I don't want to be unusual," said Colin. "I'm not going to be," and he frowned again with determination. He was a very proud boy. He lay thinking for a while, and then Mary saw his beautiful smile begin and gradually change his whole face. "I shall stop being this way," he said. "If I go every day to the garden. There is magic in there, good magic, you know, Mary. I am sure there is." "So am I," said Mary. "Even if it isn't real magic," Colin said, "we can pretend it is. Something is there, something." "It's magic," said Mary. "It's good magic." They always called it magic, and indeed it seemed like it in the months that followed. The wonderful months, the radiant months, the amazing ones. Oh, the things which happened in that garden. If you have never had a garden, you cannot understand. And if you have had a garden, you will know that it would take a whole book to describe all that came to pass there. At first, it seemed that green things would never cease pushing their way through the earth, in the grass, in the beds, even in the crevices of the walls. Then the green things began to show buds, and the buds began to unfurl and show color, every shade of blue, every shade of purple, every tint and hue of crimson. In its happy days, flowers had been tucked away into every inch and hole and corner. Ben Weatherstaff had seen it done and had himself scraped out mortar from between the bricks of the wall and made pockets of earth for lovely clinging things to grow on. Iris and white lilies rose out of the grass in sheaves, and the green alcoves filled themselves with amazing armies of the blue and white flower lances of tall delphiniums or columbines or campanulas. Some pictures. This is an amazingly beautiful picture. "She was main fond of 'em, she was," Ben Weatherstaff said. "She liked 'em things as was allus pointing up to the blue sky, she used to tell. Not as the one was of them that looked down on the earth. Not her. She just loved it. But she said as the blue sky allus looked so joyful." The seeds Dickon and Mary had planted grew as if fairies had tended them. Satiny poppies of all tints danced in the breeze by the score, gaily defying flowers which had lived in the garden for years, and which, it might be confessed, seemed rather to wonder how such new people had got there. And the roses, rising out of the grass, tangled around the sundial, wreathing the tree trunks and hanging from their branches, climbing up the walls and spreading over them with long garlands falling in cascades. They came alive day by day, hour by hour. Fair, fresh leaves and buds, tiny at first, but swelling and working, and magic until they burst and uncurled into cups of scent, delicately spilling themselves over their brims and filling the garden air. Colin saw it all, watching each change as it took place. Every morning he was brought out, and every hour of each day when it didn't rain he spent in the garden. Even gray days pleased him. He would lie on the grass watching things growing, he said. If you watched long enough, he declared, you could see buds open right up. Also, you could make acquaintance of strange, busy insect things running about on various unknown but evidently serious errands, sometimes carrying tiny scraps of straw or feather or food, or climbing blades of grass as if they were trees from whose tops one could look out to explore the country. A mole throwing up its mound at the end of its burrow and making its way out at last with the long-nailed paws, which looked so like elfish hands, had absorbed him one whole morning. Ants' ways and beetles' ways, bees' ways, frogs' ways, birds' ways, plants' ways gave Colin a new world to explore. And when Dickon revealed them all and added foxes and otters, ferrets, squirrels, trouts, and water rats and badgers' ways, there was no end to the things to talk about and think over. And here you can see owls, frogs, moles, rabbits, woodpeckers, butterflies, badgers, all kinds of things in these beautiful pictures. And then you can also see the ladybug climbing up the grass. And this was not half the magic. The fact that he had really once stood on his feet had set Colin thinking tremendously, and when Mary told him of the spell she had worked, he was excited and approved of it greatly. He talked of it constantly. Of course, there must be lots of magic in the world, he said wisely one day, but people don't know what it is like or how to make it. Perhaps the beginning is just to say nice things are going to happen until you make them happen. I am going to try an experiment. The next morning, when they went to the secret garden, he sent at once for Ben Weatherstaff. Ben came as quickly as he could and found Colin standing on his feet under a tree and looking very grand, but also very beautifully smiling. "Good morning, Ben Weatherstaff," Colin said. "I want you and Dickon and Miss Mary to stand in a row and listen to me because I am going to tell you something very important." "Aye, aye, sir," answered Ben Weatherstaff, touching his forehead. One of the long-concealed charms of Ben Weatherstaff was that in his boyhood he had once run away to sea and made sea voyages, so he could reply like a sailor. "I am going to try a scientific experiment," explained Colin. "When I grow up, I am going to make great scientific discoveries, and I am going to begin now with this experiment." "Aye, aye, sir," said Ben Weatherstaff promptly, though this was the first time he had heard of great scientific discoveries. It was the first time Mary had heard of them. But even at this stage, she had begun to realize that, unusual as he was, Colin had read about a great many things and was somehow a very convincing sort of boy. When he held up his head and fixed his strange eyes on you, it seemed as if you believed him, almost in spite of yourself, though he was only 10 years old, going on 11. At this moment, he was especially convincing because suddenly he felt the fascination of actually making a sort of speech like a grown-up person. "The great scientific discoveries I am going to make," Colin went on, "will be about magic. Magic is a great thing, and scarcely anyone knows anything about it except a few people in old books, and Mary a little, because she was born in India. I believe Dickon knows some magic, but perhaps he doesn't know he knows it. He charms animals and people. I would never have let him come to see me if he had not been an animal charmer, which is a boy charmer too, because a boy is an animal. I am sure there is magic in everything, only we have not got sense enough to hold of it and make it do things for us, like electricity and horses and steam. This sounded so imposing that Ben Weatherstaff became quite excited and really could not keep still. Aye, aye, sir, he said, and began to stand up quite straight. When Mary found this garden, it looked quite dead, proceeded Colin. Then something began pushing things up out of the soil and making things out of nothing. One day things weren't there, and another they were. I had never watched things before, and it made me feel very curious. Scientific people are always curious, and I am going to be scientific. I keep saying to myself, what is it? What is it? It's something. It can't be nothing. I don't know its name, so I call it magic. I've never seen the sun rise, but Mary and Dickon have, and from what they tell me, I am sure that is magic too. Something pushes it up and draws it. Sometimes since I've been in the garden, I've looked up through the trees at the sky, and I have had a strange feeling of being happy, as if something were pushing and drawing in my chest and making me breathe fast. Magic is always pushing and drawing and making things out of nothing. Everything is made out of magic. Leaves and trees, flowers and birds, badgers and foxes and squirrels and people. So it must all be around us. In this garden, in all the places. The magic in this garden has made me stand up. And know I am going to live to be a man. I am going to make the scientific experiment of trying to get some and put it in myself and make it push and draw me and make me strong. I don't know how to do it, but I think that if you keep thinking about it and calling it, perhaps it will come. Perhaps that is the first baby way to get it. When I was going to try to stand that first time, Mary kept saying to herself as fast as she could, you can do it, you can do it. And I did. I had to try myself at the same time, of course, but her magic helped me, and so did Dickens. Every morning and evening, and as often in the daytime as I can remember, I am going to say, magic is in me, magic is making me well. I am going to be as strong as Dickon. And you must all do it too. That is my experiment. Will you help, Ben Weatherstaff? Aye, aye, sir, said Ben Weatherstaff. Aye, aye. If you keep doing it every day as regularly as soldiers go through drill, we shall see what will happen and find out if the experiment succeeds. You learn things by saying them over and over and thinking about them until they stay in your mind forever. And I think it will be the same with magic. If you keep calling it to come to you and help you, it will get to be part of you and it will stay and do things. I once heard an officer in India tell my mother that there were people who said words over and over thousands of times, said Mary. I've heard Jem Fettleworth's wife say the same thing over thousands of times, calling Jem a drunken brute, said Ben Weatherstaff dryly. Some it always comes to that, sure enough. He got out into the Blue Lion pub and got himself as drunk as a lord. Colin drew his brows together and thought for a few minutes, and then he cheered up. Well, he said, you see, something did come of it. She used the wrong magic, and then he went out and got drunk. If she had used the right magic and had said something nice, perhaps he wouldn't have got as drunk, and maybe he would have bought her a new bonnet. Ben Weatherstaff chuckled and said there was shrewd admiration in his little old eyes. Thou'rt as clever lad as a straight-legged one, Mr. Colin, he said. Next time I see her, I'll give her a bit of a hint what magic'll do for her. She'd be rare pleased if the experiment worked and she got herself a new bonnet. Dickon had stood listening to the lecture, his round eyes shining with curious delight. Nut and Shell were on his shoulders, and he held a long-eared white rabbit in his arm and stroked it softly while it laid its ears along its back and enjoyed itself. Do you think the experiment will work? Colin asked Dickon, wondering what he was thinking. He so often wondered what Dickon was thinking when he saw him looking at him or at one of his creatures with his happy, wide smile. He smiled now, and his smile was wider than usual. Aye, he answered, that I do. It'll work the same as the seeds do when the sun shines on 'em. It'll work for sure. Shall us begin it now? Colin was delighted, and so was Mary. Colin suggested that they should all sit cross-legged under the tree. It will be like sitting in a sort of temple, said Colin. I'm rather tired, and I want to sit down. Said Dickon, thou mustn't begin by saying thou art tired. Thou might spoil the magic. Colin turned and looked at him. That's true, Colin said slowly. I must think only of the magic. It all seemed most majestic and mysterious when they sat down in their circle. Ben Weatherstaff felt as if he had somehow been led into appearing at a prayer meeting. Ordinarily, he was very fixed in being what he called, again, prayer meetings. But this being Colin's affair, he did not resent it and was indeed inclined to be gratified at being called upon to assist. Mistress Mary felt solemnly enraptured. Dickon held his rabbit in his arm, and perhaps he had made some signal that no one heard, for when he sat down, Cross-legged like the rest, the crow, the fox, the squirrels, and the lamb slowly drew near and made part of the circle, settling each into a place of rest as if of their own desire. "The creatures have come," said Colin gravely. "They want to help us." Colin looked really quite beautiful, Mary thought. He held his head high as if he felt like he were doing a sort of ceremony, and his strange eyes had a wonderful look in them. The light shone on him through the tree canopy. "Now we will begin," he said. "Shall we sway backwards and forwards?" "I canna do no swaying backward and forward," said Ben Weatherstaff. "I've got the rheumatics." "The magic will take them away," said Colin, "but we won't sway until it has done it. We will only chant." "I canna do no chanting," said Ben Weatherstaff. "They turned me out of the church choir the only time I ever tried it." No one smiled. They were all too much in earnest. Colin's face was not even crossed by a shadow. He was only thinking of magic. "Then I will say it," said Colin. "The sun is shining. That is the magic. The flowers are growing. The roots are stirring. That is the magic. Being alive is the magic. Being strong is the magic. The magic is in me. The magic is in me. It is in me. It is in me. It's in every one of us. It's in Ben Weatherstaff's back. Magic, come and help." He said it a great many times, perhaps not 1,000 times, but a good number. Mary listened. She felt as if she were at once unusual and beautiful, and she wanted him to go on and on. Ben Weatherstaff began to feel soothed into a sort of dream, which was quite agreeable. The humming of the bees and the blossoms mingled with a chanting voice and drowsily melted into a doze. Dickon sat cross-legged with his rabbit asleep on his arm and a hand resting on the lamb's back. Soot had pushed away a squirrel and huddled close to him on his shoulder. The gray film dropped over the bird's eyes. At last Colin stopped. "Now I am going to walk around the garden," he said. Ben Weatherstaff's head had just dropped forward and he lifted it with a jerk. "You have been asleep," said Colin. "Nowt of the sort," mumbled Ben. "The sermon was good enow, but I'm bound to get out afore the collection." He was not quite awake yet. "You're not in church," said Colin. "Not me," said Ben. "Who said I were? I heard every bit of it. You said the magic was in my back. The doctor calls it rheumatics." Colin waved his hand. "That was the wrong magic," he said. "You will get better. You have my permission to go to your work, but come back tomorrow." "I'd like to see thee walk round the garden," grunted Ben. It was not an unfriendly grunt, but it was a grunt. In fact, being a stubborn old party was not having entire faith in magic. He made up his mind that if he were sent away, he would climb his ladder and look over the wall so that he might be ready to hobble back if there were any stumbling. Colin did not object to his staying, and so the procession was formed. It really did look like a procession. Colin was at its head with Dickon on one side and Mary on the other. Ben Weatherstaff walked behind, and the creatures trailed after them, the lamb and the fox keeping close to Dickon, the white rabbit hopping along or stooping to nibble, and Soot following with the solemnity of a person who felt himself in charge. It was a procession which moved slowly but with dignity. Every few yards it stopped to rest. Colin leaned on Dickon's arm, and privately Ben Weatherstaff kept a sharp lookout. But now and then Colin took his hand from its support and walked a few steps alone. His head was held up all the time, and he looked very grand. "The magic is in me," he said. "The magic is making me strong. I can feel it. I can feel it." It seemed very certain that something was upholding and lifting him. He sat on the seats in the alcoves, and once or twice he sat down on the grass, and several times he paused in the path and leaned on Dickon. But he would not give up until he had gone all around the garden. When he returned to the canopy tree, his cheeks were flushed and he looked triumphant. "I did it! The magic worked!" he cried. "This is my first scientific discovery." "What will Dr. Craven say?" broke out Mary. "He won't say anything," said Colin, "because he will not be told. This is to be the biggest secret of all. No one is to know anything about it until I have grown so strong that I can run and walk like any other boy. I shall come here every day in my chair, and I shall be taken back in my chair. I won't have people whispering and asking questions, and I won't let my father hear about it until the experiment has quite succeeded. Then, sometime when he comes back to Misselthwaite, I shall just walk into his study and say, 'Here I am. I am like any other boy. I am quite well, and I shall live to be a man. It has been done by a scientific experiment.'" "He will think he is in a dream," cried Mary. "He won't believe his eyes." Colin flushed triumphantly. He had made himself believe that he was going to get well, which was really more than half the battle if he had been aware of it. And the thought which stimulated him more than any other was this imagining what his father would look like when he saw that he had a son who was as straight and strong as other fathers' sons. One of his darkest miseries in the unhealthy, morbid past days had been his hatred of being a sickly, weak-backed boy whose father was afraid to look at him. "He'll be obliged to believe them," he said. "One of the things I am going to do after the magic works and before I begin to make scientific discoveries is to be an athlete." "We shall have thee taken to boxing in a week or so," said Ben Weatherstaff. Thou'lt end up winning the belt and being the champion prize fighter of all England." Colin fixed his eyes on him sternly. "Weatherstaff, that is disrespectful. You must not take liberties because you are in on the secret. However much the magic works, I shall not be a prize fighter. I shall be a scientific discoverer." Ax pardon, sir, said Ben, touching his forehead. "I ought to have seen it wasn't a joking matter." But his eyes twinkled, and secretly he was immensely pleased. He really did not mind being snubbed, since the snubbing meant that the lad was gaining strength and spirit. And that is the end of chapter 23.